coming in. There's one more.
That's more, okay.
Yeah, it turned out nice. Yeah. It grew that fast, didn't it?
Yeah.
Wow.
This is what kids connect
That
with.
is so very cool.
Oh, they got the kids on.
It's the tomb.
Oh, wow.
So on Good Friday, when Jesus died, you put it in front, and then on Sunday. Yeah.
Well, all right, I think we'll get started. Pastor Sarah asked me to I'm sure I think she's going to be joining us, but she's still taking it easy. She asked me to do introduction of the topic and then of ourselves. So this is Good Grief, short and sweet title, and I think actually she did a lovely job introducing it during worship today. The main message for today that Pastor Brandon and I are going to go into is how grief, we never think about good and grief being in the same sentence, but grief is a normative part of human existence. It's something we're wired to do, that we all do, and we don't just do it about death. We do it about many things. This is part of how we adjust to change. So that's what we're gonna cover. So I'll have you introduce yourself.
Sure.
And I'll introduce myself.
Yeah, well, it's great to be with you this morning. My name's Brandon Newton. I'm an ordained pastor and federal chaplain for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I worked in youth ministry for 10 years, became an ordained pastor. I served most recently at Easter Lutheran Church in Egan, and I'm on the work with the Growing Through Loss Coalition here in the South Metro. I did a 2-year residency for chaplaincy at the Minnesota Masonic Children's Hospital, and then currently I serve at the Minnesota Veterans Home, which is a skilled nursing care facility for 300 of the state's veterans. So it's a nursing home, and then I moonlight. I volunteer overnights as an on-call chaplain for the Egan Police Department. So I work with families a lot who are expecting grief and families who are not expecting grief. So it's an honor to be with you here today.
And I'm Marit Appeldoorn. I think a lot of you know me. Fun fact, Brandon and I met an hour ago. Pastor Sarah reached out to each of us and said, hey, you guys want to do something? And so we've been emailing and putting something together. So it's delightful to hear more about you. Yeah, so a side of me that I don't bring to church necessarily, although some of you have heard about this already if you came to the retreat in November, heard a little bit more about me. I'm a clinical social worker by trade, and I've been in practice for about 30 years. And I have a practice with children, with adults, and then a huge part of my practice now at this stage of my career is working with depletion and burnout and even moral injury in the helping professions. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the kinds of grief that we all experience that are not death-related. And Brandon's going to talk a little bit more about death-related. All right, so let's dive in, and we will have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. So, also, I'm using my theater kid pass to project. If anybody can't hear me, just let me know. So what is the definite, we experience loss every day. I think any of us could, when we're falling asleep at night, think back on our day and think, yeah, something didn't go right or something happened or whatever, like these little mini losses. Not all losses trigger grief. What is the definition of a loss that does trigger grief? Things are no longer how they were for some reason, and they're no longer how we wanted them to be. That's the definition. Yeah. So, as you all probably know, and as I said a moment ago, grief is a normative response, like love, like all the other processes that we have kind of hardwired into our design as humans. It's normative. It's something that I think in this culture we're a little bit skittish about and don't handle particularly well, but it is something that we are designed to do. And so grief reactions are normal in response to change and loss of all kinds. It doesn't mean it always happens that way, but a grief reaction is normal. Grief reactions don't always contain the same emotions. You know, I mean, like, what's the emotion when you think of grief? What's the first emotion you think of? Sad. Right. But not all grief contains a whole lot of sadness. It depends on what's changed. And how many of you have heard about the stages of grief? Kubler-Ross, yeah. That is absolutely what I was trained in graduate school as well. Just kind of a little fun factoid is some of the research coming out now about grief is only about 10% of people go through the stages in that way of grief. Now, it's still really useful research. We still have those stages and phases. But the reason for that is because she did her research on a pretty small group of people, normed it really small, in a very specific kind of loss, in a very specific kind of situation. But grief is actually a much broader, more diverse experience than that. So just bringing that up just to kind of lead us into discussing how different grief can look in different situations. So, back to what is grief? One of the things that's so powerful to me about grief is when we are grieving a change or a loss, literally, our brains are physiologically rewiring themselves to adjust to the new reality. So to adjust that things were no longer the way they were and no longer the way they want them to be. That takes time. I mean, I'm talking like actual synapses and cells in our brain have to rewire themselves to adjust to that. And think about it, like if you're grieving something like a career or a marriage or something that has been around for a really, really long time, it takes that much longer. There's so many more circuits to try to rewire. So that is literally an exhausting process. So I'm guessing that those of you that have experienced any kind of grief, whether it's a death or a big change, you notice that you might feel a little foggy, a little bit kind of tired. Things kind of feel harder in lots of ways, not just emotionally, they just feel hard. And that's why, is that when we are rewiring our brains, which is so much harder than it is if you're a child, if you're an adult, it takes, I always say like rewiring my brain hurts. Like when I'm trying to learn a new habit, it just hurts. It's really hard. We're tired because we can't be on autopilot. You know, think about the millions of ways that we move through our day. Let's say that you're in a pre-retirement, for example, which that's a non-death loss. You're going to the same place every day, you're doing the same thing, talking to the same people. You know where the copy machine is, you know where the lights are, you know the way to get there in your car, right? And then that's all on autopilot. You wake up your first day of retirement, you're at home, so that's more familiar, but a lot of other things aren't. So it's tiring. Yeah. So I've already listed a couple, but some examples of non-death loss, and we are going to talk about death, but just trying to normalize all of the kinds of loss that we just go through as we move through our lives. There's one that didn't make it on the slide, which was my error, which is loss of ability or mobility or health status in some ways.
Can you say that again?
Yep, ability, mobility, or health. Mm-hmm. So that is it's a loss within our own bodies, which changes a lot of stuff, and we have to rewire our brains for that. Loss of identity. That comes in many ways, but you know the main one I wanted to kind of put up there because it's happens to everyone at some point is job loss, even if you wanted that loss. Job loss, job change, retirement, that is a loss of identity. Loss of relationship. So we're not yet talking about death, but we are talking about divorce. We're talking about estrangements, when you stop talking with someone that you were close to, whether it's family member, friends. Also, when you're my age and you want your kids, that's not estrangement, but it's a change of relationship. It's a loss of that daily relationship. That can be a grief-triggering loss. I know it was for me. Loss of identity. Loss of relationship. So, and remember, we're not yet talking about death, but some examples of non-death loss, and we are going to talk about death. And loss of community. So moving, and we're going to talk about this next, moving is usually a really joyful, positive thing. Most of us want to move if we move, not always, but most of us want to. But we don't factor in that we lose kind of the autopilot, we lose our community once we change where we were. We lose our familiar house. We lose a million different things that we take for granted, right? There's a kind of more serious, and I think very present, at least in my mind these days, kind of loss, which is loss of faith in institutions, loss of trust, loss of a sense of safety. Many of us, not all, but many of us are moving through the world right now, maybe feeling some of these things, like what is happening in the world. That, for some of us, is a big loss. Some say, no, we don't. We trusted this entity to take care of us, and it didn't. That's a loss that we have to rewire our brains around. Does that all make sense? Any questions about anything so far?
I do have a question.
Yes.
So when you said only 10% of the population go through the steps,
Yeah.
so if you really don't grieve properly, you hold that on forever and ever, can you address that?
That is a wonderful question. And we're going to spend a lot of time addressing that exact thing, because the answer is, I think the takeaway for me from that research was that there are so many ways to grieve properly. Those stages that was the cutting edge research at the time, and what I was taught is if you don't do it in that order, then you didn't grieve. And the truth of the matter is, that's not so, right? Anyone who's grieved probably knows that. Yeah. So I love that question. Okay, back to dissonance. So dissonance is when grief is kind of complicated. There's a rub there, there's some tension there. Many ways that plays out. But one is, we're talking about moving, retirement, sending your kid to college, whatever it might be. We don't necessarily feel real sad, we might feel sad, but we also feel happy. But our brains are still grieving. And so that's a dissonance. Has anyone ever experienced that? I certainly have, many times. And so when that happens, if we're feeling like, wow, I'm so excited, I'm moving into this new community, and it's got all these amenities, and I know what I'm going to do, and I love it, why am I so tired? Why do I feel so spacey? Why am I not totally over the moon about it? That means, and we're going to talk about this, we need to take care of our bodies as if we're grieving, even if we're not devastated with sadness. So that's the emotional complexity. Disenfranchised grief, I'll just mention two. So disenfranchised grief is when you are grieving a loss that maybe is a secret, that nobody knows about. And I think, when I was training back in the 90s, we talked about that in, say you're a closeted LGBT person and your partner dies. And nobody knows about the relationship. Or people do know, but they're like, we don't want to talk about that. Or it's not real. Or it's your friend, whatever, right? So that's disenfranchised grief. It's just not understood in some way. Why are you happy about X or Y? Why are you processing this way? So that is when it is not, we are very relational beings, we are social beings. And so when we have something that we're grieving and the people around us don't get it, that adds complexity to the grief process. So this is exactly to your point, Jem. So there are so many ways to grieve, and Brandon's going to go into this even more, but these terms may look familiar to you. If not, I'm going to go over them just briefly. So some folks grieve instrumentally, instrumental grief. I don't know if anyone's ever heard that term. Instrumental grievers are action-oriented, and they process it intellectually. Not totally. They get busy, they get moving, they maybe, like, I'm going to start a scholarship in that person's honor, I'm going to throw myself into this next phase of my life that's very action-oriented. Instrumental grief is a valid way to grieve. It's a valid way to help that restructuring of our brains along. It's not always understood by others, right? Like, why are you acting that way? Aren't you sad? Aren't you whatever? But it's a valid way to grieve. The second is intuitive grief, which is sort of the more typical, like what we think of when we think of grief, which is if I'm grieving and intuitively, I'm grieving with my emotions, my right brain, I'm sad, I'm exhausted, and I'm reaching out to community a lot and needing support from others a lot. That's intuitive grief, so it's very right brain. The other instrumental grief is more left brain. Non-linear grief means that we can do both. And we hop around, and like one day we're really mad, and one day we feel really productive, and one day we can't get out of bed, and that is most often, I think, how we grieve, non-linear. And it's all good. All these ways of grieving are good ways.
What if you just don't want to get out of bed?
Well, it's my motto about these things is it's only a problem if it's a problem.
Say again, I'm sorry.
It's only a problem if it's a problem.
Yeah, I guess.
There are days when not getting out of bed is exactly what the doctor ordered,
Amen.
you know? And we should let ourselves do that and listen to our bodies, which is what we're going to talk about next. Got it? Excellent.
That's my cue.
That was your That was a meaningful look. It's when it doesn't let up, when anything doesn't let up, or it feels stuck. That's when it's a problem. So what do we do? That's always the next question in my mind when I'm thinking about anything big that we have to process. What do we do? How do we handle it? What are good ways to take care of ourselves while we are grieving to help that rewiring of the brain along? Here are some things, and those of you that were in the room with me at the retreat in November, I did mention a couple of these, but I talk about them all the time. I can't help it. So the first is neurobiological rest. Even if you're happy about the transition that's happened, but your body is telling you that it's grieving, it's important to rest. Does that make sense? So neurobiological rest is anything for you, and we are all very individual about this, anything that makes us feel cared for, or supported, nurtured, or creative. That, for me, kind of differs day to day. I mean, I've got my tried and true, regular, like napping and many things, but someday, one day I might want to actually try to be creative and write a little bit. Another day I might want to call my friend. That's rest. Another thing that's really critical is finding predictable rhythms in life. Anytime you have a loss, look for the predictability in the rest of your life. So I had a yoga teacher once who said to me, who said to all of our class actually, like the way to do like a balance pose and not fall over is think about you have to have at least one part of your body steady to let the rest of your body be flexible. You have to be rooted in something. Of course, she could like do it with her arms. And that's never been my dream. But you look for the predictability. So if you move to a new place, if that's your non-grief or your non-death loss, you move out of your community, what would you do? You find rhythm and routine in your day as quickly as possible. You come to church every Sunday as quickly as possible. You find all this, right? You just get predictability. So that's really actually very important for our brains. It helps them not be so exhausted as soon as we can find rhythm. Also finding purpose and agency. So purpose is finding meaning in life, meaning, and agency is feeling like you can do something about it. That's the difference between those two words. So find some way to feel meaningful and then find a way to do something about it. Here's what's great about all of this neurobiological self-care stuff. None of it has to be a big deal. So I will share an example from my own life. I am having surgery on Tuesday, and I am a planner and a Virgo and all these things, and so the not being able to control how this is going to go is a big deal for me. So the other day, what did I do? I cleaned out our upstairs hall closet. Just cleaned it out. And it helped my brain feel better. It just helped. Not related to what I'm going to go through at all, but it helped. So also finding community and understanding. It's not always easy for us to talk about our losses, especially with these non-death losses if we're supposed to be happy about them. But it's really important to find people who will get it, because that is also very good for our brains. Whether that's people in community, whether that's family, friends, a therapist. It's a huge part of the work I do. It's just helping somebody's brain feel really understood. And lastly, ritual. Ritual is the right brain equivalent of finding routine in your day. It is a way to find meaning, to organize, and to keep having a relationship with the thing that you're grieving. And we've been doing it for thousands of years in thousands of ways. All right, so on that note, was it right? Was it good? All right, take it away.
Thank you. Well, I thought you invited me to be here because the handout at the Yagam retreats on the Good Grieve, the 10 stages by Granger Westburn. Again, my name's Brandon, and one thing I did mention is I have the honor and joy of being a board certified chaplain. So I went through 2 additional years of training and certification to be able to work with people of different faiths and people with no faith. So I'll try to give kind of examples of rituals and things that are helpful for people in kind of various settings of life and death. Before I do that, let's take a deep breath. And we do that because I'm going to talk about human death. Right? And so I would imagine if you're here, you've experienced the loss of somebody who really meant a lot to you. Right? And perhaps, though, you haven't thought yet about your own death. Right? That's a hard thing to think about. So keep returning to that breathing. But I want to start with, we ended with ritual here, I want to start with this kind of fun woodcut of a ritual. It's kind of blurred out because I don't have permission to use it. But from Making a Good Death by Gracia Grindal in Word and World, Volume 34, number 1, Winter 2014. She uses this woodcut of what the woodcutter, Albrecht Dürer, the Dutch woodcutter, depicts a good death. This is how he depicts Mary, mother of Jesus' death. This depiction is from the 18th century. So probably didn't look like that, right? But you can be thinking about some of the rituals. Here we have Mary in the center. Over here we have, you can kind of see his fun hat. We have Peter in liturgical dress, and he's got a mitre, and he's asperging Mary with holy water. And then we've got John here is helping Mary hold a lighted candle to keep the devil away. Then we've got several over here are reading scripture. This guy there, he's reading scripture. There are several here kneeling in prayer. This guy brought a giant cross on a pole, right? So you think about, well, that would be an interesting thing to have in your hospital room, right? But one of the things that the woodcutter points out is that over here is the Last Supper. A paten and a chalice that maybe they had communion, right? The Lord's Supper. But also, people will notice who isn't there. There's no depiction of Jesus waiting to receive his mother into eternity. And that's because of the theology of Albrecht Dürer is that Christ is present in the disciples who are gathered around Mary. So Christ is indeed present through each of these people who's in the room with Mary. And so this is a realistic picture of Mary receiving comfort and support with her last breaths. Oh, I forgot here's all the words that go with it. Yeah, you're gonna.
Okay, you got it.
So there's all the things, they're just really small. And I will, speaking of loss and grief, today's my second day with bifocals.
Oh,
And I hate it. So I'm like, whoa, I don't,
Talk about the wire in your brain.
oh my gosh,
Grieving.
it's amazing I got here.
Just keep your own glasses handy.
Yeah, so, yep. So, should we have the gift of knowing when our time will come? When our time to die will come. Excuse me, have you thought about what you might want that to look like? Do you want any kind of music to be played? Do you want any hymns to be sung? Would you like your family or those gathered to have communion? Is there anybody for sure you want to be there? Is there anybody for sure you don't want to be there? Are there any Bible passages you want to hear? I have residents at the Veterans Home who we have CDs, yeah, I guess, right? CDs that will just play somebody reading the Bible. They want that on. Who's going to contact your pastor to let them know that you're dying, right? Because I don't know if you knew this, but most pastors can't read your mind. Right? Who's going to share that information? So in the hospital setting, we had a lot of different rituals that we did with people to make a good, meaningful death. So next slide. Next slide too. So one of the things we did was called the blessing of the body. So after each, we would gather around the hospital bed. And this wasn't for the pediatric hospital. This was in the ICU on the East Bank UMMC hospital. Next slide. So we gather around if those who were present said they wanted to have an end-of-life ritual. We'd start at the person who was dying's head. And I'd ask, what did this person know a lot about? What wisdom did they share with you? We'd go around. And then together we'd say, we bless these memories. And we'd look at their eyes and we'd say, what did you see together? What beautiful memories do you have from trips and places you saw? We bless these memories. And then we go to their ears. I didn't put ears on there. What was their favorite music? We go to their nose. What smell will always remind you of them? And we bless these memories. And their mouth. Did they have a favorite food or drink, or what was their favorite thing to eat together? Right? For my grandpa, he would always sneak me cookies. Well after my mom said I couldn't have any cookies. Right? Hands. What sort of work did they do? And we bless these memories. Their legs, what did they stand for? Tell me about their values. Their feet, where'd they come from? Where are their roots? That's when you learn most people were farmers. And their heart, what did they love? Can you tell of a moment that you knew they loved you? And we bless these memories. And then together we say, we name, we love you, and we carry these memories of you with us forever.
That's beautiful.
And then oftentimes that was on the pre-surgery unit for people who are going to donate their organs.
Oh,
And so that's before these pieces of them went to other places. But that doesn't mean you have to be donating your organs to hear these things from your loved ones, right? In fact, it was doing this ritual that changed how I show up as a dad. Because I was like, one of these days my kids are going to talk about me. Right? And I better start being a better dad. We also look at Ira Biak. He's got 4 phrases. The 4 phrases he wrote a book about. That's him, right there. He's a palliative care doctor. And he looks at these phrases of, this is for particularly when families knew they didn't have much time left. And they wanted to know, how do we spend this time meaningfully? How do you say goodbye to your loved one? And so they could either go one-to-one and visit with their loved one, or they could do this as a group. It's not a push button. We'll go to the next slide there. So you start, all right. That must mean is my battery running out, probably? Sugar beets. Well, he's going to stay with us for a while. And you would start with, thank you for. And then you would complete the phrase. And then you would say, I'm sorry for. And you would name all the things you want to apologize for. And you say, I forgive you for. Because it turns out nobody's perfect. Right? You would name the things you want to forgive this person for. And you would always end with, I love you. And you'd name, what are some things you love about them? And you'd say goodbye. Alright, so if those 4 phrases pique your interest, I have a whole hour-long presentation about them next Tuesday at the Growing Through Loss. Which is good, because that's all, we only got the first one. So there are several components of good grief. Alright, and so I'm going to be referring to grieving well, healthfully, and honestly as good grief. Alright, so as referenced, you might be familiar with Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. You might even know Granger Westberg came up with 10. So if you thought 5 was a lot, Granger Westberg came up with 10 stages of good grief. They're helpful, but the limitations are that none of these tell us how to do it. Right? So there are grieving tasks that psychologist J.W. Warden identifies. These grieving tasks for intuitive, instrumental, and intuitive grievers. The first task, you'll have to write this down, because we lost the computer.
Randy, can you also send me the slideshow if?
Yeah, I
Okay,
will.
so-
Send you it as a PDF.
Yeah,
so-
and then I'm happy to make it available or just email me for it.
Is that okay?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Oh yeah, sorry.
The first task is to accept the reality of the loss. To accept it. Okay? Well, good grief, in my opinion, is grief that faces the reality of the loss. How many of you have heard how many of you have tried to chase the sunset? Anybody? What happened? You just keep going, don't you? You ever catch it?
They come to the club.
It just keeps going. You're going to wear yourself out trying to forget about your grief, trying to forget about the loss. So what do? Lutherans know this. You go back into the darkness because you trust that the sun's going to rise again, isn't it? And so you enter that grief, that darkness, knowing God's going to meet you there, and that sun's going to rise again. So we face the reality of the loss. Initially, we experience all kinds of things: denial, numbness, even busyness. Right? We got a funeral to plan. Right? We got dozens of documents to sign, and tons of people calling. All of these things are important tasks that need to be done, but this is meant to protect us from the terrible feelings that come with grief. Numbness, shock, denial. That's your mind trying to protect you from feeling all the bad things about sadness. But it's important to feel them. All right, so as those feelings start to set in, good grief faces them. There's a helpful feelings wheel. I'll show you the little one. It's helpful to name your feelings. I didn't know there were so many feelings because I was raised by a dad who taught me that you feel hungry or tired. Right? But I look on this and I see, oh, it says angry, and then you go to the next level and it says, let's see here, and it says bitter, and then the next level says violate. How did grief steal my loved one from me? That's what I'm mad about. Right? So there's feeling wheels out there to help us name our feelings, so that way we can ride them, right? Rather than run away from them. As we reflect on our relationship with our loved one, we realize they were more than just, let's say, for example, well, I hate to use that example, but we'll say I lose my wife. Right? She's amazing. She's still with us, thank God. But as I reflect on that relationship, I realize she was more than just a wife. She was, and then there's this helpful picture from a book, this one, that helps us identify all the different roles she played in my life. So it's not just losing a partner, it's losing security. Because it turns out we're pretty dependent on her income, right? Because I'm a chaplain, right? And I lost more than my wife because it's a relationship where she was a close friend, right? And then I lost more than my wife because I lost my sense of self. I don't want to be a widow. That's not a word I ever identified myself with, so who am I now? Right? We've got all these things that we lose. It's more than a person, isn't it? And so, this is welcome to the grief club. It's maybe a little too snarky for some. I think it's right down. So Dr. Thomas Addick says, well, name those 4 to 8 roles that the deceased person filled in your life, and then write a paragraph about how they filled each of those roles. We don't realize how deep our grief is until we come to a task that that loved one used to do. Right? My wife used to cut the grass. How do I even start the lawnmower? Right? Which, I mean, technically that's my job. But she does, like, that's the only thing I could think of. Right? How do you do all these things that they used to do? Well, then Addick would say, well, you need to build a community around you to help you with some of those things. Isn't it hard to ask for help?
Yes.
But do you know how many people around you want to help and they don't know how? Right? So write those things down. Who can help me fill some of these gaps? I have a friend who has that, she would say that's why grief comes in waves. It comes in and it goes out, because as you come to something that they used to do, it hits you. Right? So she used to welcome that grief as a substitute teacher. She was she'd say, all right, I know you're just here for a short time, but what are you trying to teach me today? And she'd say, hello, depression. What are you trying to tell me about my grief? And she also ended up being able to, every time she came to a task that her loved one used to do, she'd say, thank you, Greg, for always cutting the grass. So kind of rewiring her brain to feel gratitude. Work through the complexity of the pain of grief. Work through the complexity of the pain of grief. Some of that is making those lists if you're a list person. If you're an intuitive griever, gosh, do I recommend meeting with a counselor. Finding somebody who you can talk candidly about your feelings and about your sense of loss. Because believe it or not, sometimes even our closest friends, they get tired of hearing about it. Don't they? Right? Meet with your pastor. Name those emotions. Identify each of those pains. Write down 2 strategies you can do to help with that pain. For example, whenever I feel anger rising within me, I'm going to close my eyes and I'm going to take 10 deep breaths. Right? And I'm going to feel that anger and then I'm going to let it go. Okay? Number 3 is to adjust to an environment in which the deceased is missing. This is hard. Adjust to an environment in which the deceased is missing. I forgot to say there's no timeline. Right? You're not going to do this the next day. That's too much. I've heard from parishioners that one of the hardest things after a loved one dies is to come back to church. Because the last time they were there was for their loved one's funeral. And they don't want to sit by themselves. So sometimes there are, churches will have a group of friends who meet beforehand and go in together. Or people who just, gosh, you get tired of cooking for one, or you don't know how to cook for one. So, groups of friends eat together occasionally, right? You can take away some of that group. Let's see here, where am I in my notes? Discovering who you are now. There's a lot of adjustments, right? What do you do with all their belongings? How can these things find new life and be a blessing to somebody else? Maybe you're a single parent now. What does that look like, and how do we figure those things out? I'm going to keep moving. Is that okay?
Yeah.
There's a lot to think about, isn't there?
Yeah.
It's too much for me. The 4th task, and this is the last one. I mean, according to Word, there's more. There's always more, right? To emotionally relocate the deceased and continue with life. Emotionally relocate the deceased and continue with life. How do Christians do this? Where do we locate our loved ones? Yeah, right? Heaven. A good place, right? We imagine them in heaven. We imagine them in God's kingdom, in the full presence of God. Right? That's hard to do right away. Because frankly, I hear from a lot of people that they're pretty mad at God. Especially if their loved one died too soon. Right? So there are other things too, is we start to talk about our loved one in the past tense instead of the present tense. That's a big shift. That's a painful one. But our friends notice. This is what Westberg refers to as living with the loss. Healthy adjustment recognizes the loss, but is no longer disturbed by it. I've got two examples. A gentleman who was a member of our congregation, his wife died, and the last good memory he had was putting up their Christmas tree. But he didn't take any pictures of it. And so he kept that Christmas tree up. Anybody want to guess how long?
A couple years.
Yeah, I mean, the correct answer is as long as it takes, right? 3.5 years. And then as he kind of incorporated talking about that loss, his kids decided they would take a picture of the tree. And so they had a picture of the tree, a picture of his wife. They put them on a little table with a mini Christmas tree. So he's got a little remembrance altar for his loving wife. But at least it doesn't take up the whole living room anymore. Right? Right? Or I think about living with the loss. I remember when my grandpa died, I was driving home for the funeral, and that song, I Can Only Imagine, came on the radio. And I couldn't see, I was crying, I was just bawling, so I had to pull over. Well, 7 years later, that song comes back on, and I still feel sad, miss my grandpa. But I don't have to pull over because I'm not bawling as much, right? So I can still safely get to my destination. So living with the loss, it's a good thing I brought all these. Looks like this. This is how we carry our grief. Okay? Because a lot, you don't get rid of it. But it does become easier to carry. So this is a garbage bag, right? Can you imagine carrying a garbage bag around with you every day? And then eventually it turns into more of like a suitcase or a briefcase. Yeah, if you work through it, eventually it's more like a satchel or a purse. It becomes different to carry. But it doesn't go away. And something tells me maybe we wouldn't want it to go away. Isn't that love? All right, my final thing. Put all these notes up here. Very practical recommendation for you. Please, please. This is coming from a chaplain who served in hospital settings, a chaplain who works with, I'm at a nursing home now. I do 1.67 funerals a week, right? And I'm at Fort Snelling 2 or 3 times a week for burials. Please, this is something very practical you can do. After a loved one's death, the next of kin has to decide pretty quickly, if it hasn't already been decided, what funeral home is going to pick up the body. This might sound strange, but the first week after a loved one has died is filled with so many decisions that you don't have time to grieve. You don't have time to feel the reality of the loss. One of the things you can do right now to help your loved ones experience good grief is talk about what you want after you die. I think you're doing this next week. Do you have a preference for a funeral home? Did you know if you prepay for your funeral home, and then on your deathbed or after you died, your family decides they don't like that funeral home, that money has to be transferred to a different funeral home? Did you know that? Yeah, state law. Minnesota is a good place to die. All right? So you take care of those costs. You can plan your funeral even right now. Do you have a preference for a funeral home? Would you like to be cremated or buried? In fact, when I gather with families, the number one source of disagreement is, did their loved one want to be cremated or buried? Nobody knows. So they have to decide. That's a pretty big decision. Maybe make it for them. All right? Tell them. And finally, are there Bible passages that you want read at your funeral? Are there hymns that you want sung at your funeral? That will save a lot of time and a lot of arguments, and that will help families with good grief. Funeral, or I should say memorial service. Funeral is from the Latin word for corpse. So if your body's present in a casket, that's a funeral. If you're cremated or just a picture, that's a memorial service. Technicalities that nobody cares about. Okay? Whatever it says on the bulletin is what we're doing. Okay? All right. I think I'm well over my time.
Okay, should we like open it up for some questions, discussion for a few minutes?
Thank you for sharing the short list of, I can't remember her first name, but Kuba Ross.
Yeah.
I worked on a psychiatric unit in a hospital, and when my dad passed, and the head of the unit gave me an assignment, which was to read that book on grief and death and loss or whatever. So I went through the steps, to please her, but she made the assumption that I had a very close relationship with my father, and he was a quiet alcoholic his whole life, and he had cancer, and so I witnessed, and it was kind of a relief actually when he passed in some respects, we definitely lost her too, but, so thank you for sharing that little trite.
It's not always how it goes.
It's not.
My dad liked my uncle's funeral. It was, a nice one done. And we went over to Anderson's over here, and it's me and Tommy, my cousin Cindy, and her husband Ray back there. And the only instructions we got from Dad was, as cheap as possible. And it took the mortician, a good half hour to get into the frame of mind that, how much does that cost? And, just the bare minimum, cremation was fine with him, so that's fine. And then he says, an urn, and I said, well, he comes back from the crematorium, a large Spam can. It looks like a large Spam can, that's what it is. It's better than anchovy can. And it's plain tin metals. And he says, well, do you want to decorate it? And I'm going, well, no. But don't you want to paint it? I said, on your dime. And he painted it for us because my dad said, you don't have to spend a fortune. And after we got through talking with all of this, and we're having a great time, the three of us. And my cousin's husband in the back row says, okay, you mean I can pre-plan my own funeral? And the mortician says, yeah, you can. He says, good. I don't want any of those three having anything to do with it. And we're okay because his daughter's the minister, so we'll see what happens.
Oh, we buried my father in his tackle box.
Oh, yeah. All right.
My brother said that.
Buried her
My
father in
sister
his
said,
tackle
he wants
box.
to be cremated. We said, oh, he does? Because he never said anything to us. I said, fine. And he said, well, how about, I don't want to urn or whatever. I said, well, what about his old battered tackle box?
Oh,
sure.
Great idea. I like it.
He was a fisherman.
Yeah.
I love that.
Well, and too, if you are a veteran, there are veterans benefits to help with the cost of cremation or burial. I'm not as familiar with all of those, but
Have either of you had a situation, I've seen it a couple times, where I mean, I totally support the more you can inform what your death looks like, the choices that are to be made, like, it's such a gift. So, complete reinforcement of that. But I've run into this a couple times where the wish of the one dying was that there be no service. And I'm sure that's for all kinds of reasons, right? I don't want people gathering, I don't want a big hoopla, okay? And so then the family who receives that is at times struggling, like, what do we honor? Like, I think if the wishes are in line with what you're hoping for, or at least amenable to that, is one thing, right? But if it's like, suddenly I'm in a situation where now I feel like I'm dishonoring the one who's died, but I think we need, and this person deserves a space for us to, like, do you have examples or suggestions for when you run into the struggle to honor the wish?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you?
Oh, I've had examples of that just in my therapy practice. And what we end up doing is thinking about, like, how do we hold both? How do we hold what you need and what your family needs, and also hold true to the memory and being respectful of. And so, in just the one example that pops into my mind, what the family ended up doing was they honored, there was no service, but they rented a party room at a restaurant and had everybody come, and they ate and they swapped memories, and people stood up and said things, and they felt like they had been able to celebrate the person.
Well, you're hearing the term now, celebration of life.
Yeah, it's true.
Because of his 70-year-long buddyship, Jim just died, and they aren't having a funeral now. They say in April they're going to have a celebration of life.
Yeah.
And that, because, like you say, death is, part of it, but having to remember the person, how they affected you, how you love them. I think that's, when you can share that, you know that people are sharing it with you, that you're not all alone.
Well, I think you're touching on something really, well, everybody is, right? Touching on something really important. If somebody says, I don't want a funeral, I don't want a gathering, remember, at least in the Lutheran tradition, the funeral is for the people who are still living.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. It's so helpful to
Um,
see how many people came and cared.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
and I've experienced that too with some people. I mean, everything is every situation is so different, but I've worked with a couple of families that call it celebration of life. And that feels good to emphasize the celebration, but I've met with a couple like partners who have lost their spouses, and what they missed out on was seeing others cry with them.
Yeah.
Because there was so much emphasis on, let's get together, let's not make this depressing, well, that's good, that's part of what we're doing, but also like, then you go home and are like, is anyone sad about this
Am I
with me?
understood?
Right, and it kind of, and every
Sharing
situation's
grief.
different, there might be a time when that really makes sense, but it's just to like not forget that might also be.
I was gonna say, I know, we just did a burial for somebody who didn't want a service, but you still got 15 minutes for it still. Right, for the military honors and a prayer, and then get out of there. But they didn't want any sort of gathering, but the family still wanted to remember them, so they planned a motorcycle trip through the Black Hills this summer. So I think there's still those things as well. Okay, we're not going to have a gathering, but we still want to remember them.
Yes.
We're going to meet at the VFW. We're going to meet here. We're going to tell stories and things. And it's not the same thing as a service as well. And also the French Creole tradition. Too, everybody's like, I want to be a celebration, like when the jazz bands are going through the streets of New Orleans. That's actually after the funeral. You process with the body to the church, and it's much more mournful, and then after the service, you celebrate.
That makes a lot of sense.
We told our kids, do what you need to do to get through this. Whether you want us, because we're not going to know. I mean, we're going to maybe. But that way they can do it how you want to do it. Because we're not going to do it.
Right. I was gonna say something similar. So we've had a conversation with our kids,
And I said to we have 3 sons, I said, the funeral is for you. So if there's something meaningful that you want, go for it. But I have since thought about it because it's a combination.
Yeah.
It's going to be a gift to our kids if we have planned our funeral and we have said what's important to us. Because at least they know that. But if they decide to do something different, but it is that combination of they want to honor our wishes, but at the same time, it has to be something, because really the funeral is for them.
Yeah, getting them in the planning makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Well, and in some ways,
That's why we're
They
gonna
will
have
also-
difficult conversations.
right, but it's, oftentimes a service that becomes meaningful, like part of what makes it meaningful is knowing
Yeah.
you've also honored the, right, that it wasn't just like developing it from total scratch,
Yeah.
which could sometimes be like, how did we do,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yes, but I think that combination, it's a dance
Yeah.
between those, yeah.
So Marie and I have our boulder over at Lebanon Hill Cemetery. All of our 4 kids, 9 grandkids know where Grandma and Grandpa are gonna be. So it makes a big difference, so.
It is helpful to have a place that you can come back to.
I put myself at the top of a hill in the middle of the cemetery, and she said, well, this space, is open, you can't put anything there. And I said, well, I love open space, so put me right next to it. Oh, no, it's the sidewalk that goes to the now covered thing. People are gonna be putting out their cigarettes on my headstone.
You're still serving others, right?
You're useful still.
My son works for the city. I said, kids are gonna be playing and throwing candy wrappers on, but just pick up the trash.
Put that on your headstone.
Just a couple things. In our mobile society, where family isn't around to care for, our family has chosen cremation, and we scatter the ashes at a special spot, and I have memorial stones at home. So that there is a place of remembrance, but there's also a permanent place where we can go where things were scattered and have particular meaning. The other thing, there's been a lot of talk about the funerals. I would also add, if you've done your paperwork and you have your healthcare directives and all of that, I have begged friends and family to talk to your family so they know what your real wishes are.
Yeah.
Because we ran into a circumstance with a beloved cousin whose wife misunderstood. He was a Marine, he would never have wanted, and he was in a vegetative state for 10 years because she thought she had to do everything she could to keep him alive. And it was horrible for his mother and his siblings because they knew what he would have wanted. So talk about that leading up step to the memorial service and the funeral. Make sure your closest ones know
Our
what you really
doctors
want.
want us to have that
Well-
written and in place.
Well, it's not just the documents. You need to have the conversation around it so they truly understand where you are. Yes, the documents are important,
Right.
but you need that closeness with your people.
Let's do one more question, or?
Okay, really let them know what you really want, because my uncle stepped off the curb and got hit by a car and died. Okay? They cremated him. He never mentioned what he wanted done. So for about 3 years, he was in the trunk of my cousin's car next to his favorite golf clubs. It took a while for the family to decide to put a memorial bench up facing the Pacific in San Jose or whatever it was, and then they put out the bench and then, bye. Just opened it up and said goodbye. But let them know it, because that's one of our favorite family stories is, Uncle Cliff loved to golf. He stayed there for a while.
I'd just like to make one comment. The way I look at death is it's me being so selfish because I want my loved ones to stay with me. I want them to be here. So I just feel like I am being selfish, but then too, you've got to remember that death is not final. And the way I was raised with love and through my mom. I mean, I can go out in the garden and I can just hear her say, Marie, get that last weed. And I'll just stop and I'll say, thanks, Mom. And you know what? They will always be with you. They always will. And if you can remember that, it helps a lot.
Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.